Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Standing in the Dark, a weekly podcast series, actually now a bi-weekly podcast series where we interview stage managers on Broadway, off-Broadway, and in regional theater. Today we are with Peter von Mayrhauser, sitting in his lovely apartment. Hello, Peter.
Hello.
Thank you for being with us today.
I'm glad you're here.
So, Peter, how did you get started with theater in general and as a stage manager?
In general, I grew up outside of Boston, and my parents were great theater goers, and even though neither one of them was involved in show business, and they belonged to something called the Show of the Month Club, and they would always go on Saturday matinees. And one time, my father couldn't go, so my mother asked my older brother, and he said no. She asked my older sister. She said, forget about it. And it came down to me, and I said, sure, I'm not doing anything. I was about 12. And we went into Boston, and we saw the first national tour of West Side Story. And I had no idea what that was going to be like. And I had no idea that it was going to end sadly, for one thing. Anyway, the whole thing just knocked me out. And I was totally sold from that moment on. I started subscribing to Variety at the age of 14. I got Variety every single week in the mail. And I heard about a thing called summer stock. So when I was 15, I applied at a place that I'd heard about up in Vermont, which was a very small non-equity place, and I became an apprentice. And I apprenticed through my high school years there every summer. And then after that, during college, I did more summer stock, basically. And I was completely sold on theater. I was obsessed, to use Seth Brodetsky's term. And in fact, I went to college for theater too, to Northwestern, which was known for its theater program. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very good time for the Northwestern theater program when I was there, but nevertheless, I had a great time, and I continued working mostly as an actor, but by the end of school, and having done summer stock too, I realized that I really wasn't a very good actor, for one thing. And also, I realized that I didn't really want it that badly, but I knew I wanted to be around theater. So I had done some stage management in stock along with performing, and I thought, I'll tell you exactly what happened. Actually, I was on a trip to Europe right after getting out of Northwestern, and I said to myself, when I was far away from all the scene at Northwestern, which was very, very competitive, and I said, I don't want to be an actor. I'm going to try to be a stage manager, because stage manager gets to work with every single department, and when I had done that, I had really enjoyed it. So right after Europe, I came to New York, and I had a friend who worked at the Public Theater, and it was nice, actually, having worked in summer stock, because I did come to New York at least knowing a few people. I wasn't completely, unknown. I had some contacts. At least I had people to call. And so she said, well, you should go over to the Public Theater. So I went over and made an appointment with Bernie Gersten, who was sort of Joe Papp's, he ran the operation day to day, Bernie. And he was in charge of hiring stage managers. So I made an appointment, had to wait about 2 hours to see him, and finally I got to see him, and I handed him my resume. I was quite full of myself because I had done the summer stock, I had gone to Northwestern, I had a theater degree. And I said, I went in and said very boldly, I want to be a stage manager. And he said, okay, the prop office is right down the hallway. So I went down the hall and really basically became a props person to begin with. But almost immediately, it was like winter then. I worked on a few little things, but my first real big things were up in the park at the Delacourt. And I was on the prop crew, exactly. I was on the prop crew at the Delacourt, and I loved it. I had a blast. It was really, really fun. But all the time I was, hoping to move further as stage manager. I was, chomping at the bit, as anybody does, I think, when they're starting off. You just want to do everything. And anyway, so I stayed at the Public for a while, and I became officially an assistant stage manager. But I was basically doing props. So I got some other jobs on shows you've never, ever heard of off-Broadway. But I started to get stage manager jobs. And I joined Equity, and and I started to get credits, even though I didn't have a play that ran longer than 2 weeks. I started to get experience and started to actually do it. But of course, I always wanted to do more. I was very ambitious. And at that time, in the Public Theater, I skipped a step. So then I went back to work at the Public Theater as a stage manager, as an Equity stage manager. So that was a big deal for me. And they were doing a number of workshops at that point in a show called The Chorus Line. And even when it was in workshop, everybody was buzzing about it in the building. I mean, it was electric in there. And a stage manager that I had befriended was the head stage manager, the PSM, on it during all these workshops. And he was a good friend of mine. We had labored, at the Public for about 1.5 years together on various projects. And anyway, he said to me, this really looks like it's going to go into the Newman down at the Public. And it's probably going to go beyond that. But for right now, it looks like we're definitely going into a run at the Newman after all these workshops. And he said, I'd like you to be my assistant on that. Well, I was like, oh my God, I've been waiting. Because at this point, I've been in New York over 4 years, almost 5 years. And I was really, really ready. I thought, when am I going to make the jump from off-Broadway to Broadway? There was a lot more off-Broadway then, actually, too. Anyway, so I met Michael Bennett. I came down to one of the rehearsals. We were always peeking through the doors anyway, looking at the rehearsals. And it seemed to go well. I was very excited. I knew about Michael Bennett's work, of course. He was already quite well established then. And I was thrilled. And then Jeff called, this guy, by the way, the PSM was named Jeff Hamlin. And he was extremely supportive to me. And that's sort of a running theme. You may have found this in the other interviews you've done, but there's always people who help you along the way. And this was somebody who really helped me. Anyway, so then I got a call, I don't know what it was, a couple of weeks later, and he said, no, I'm afraid it's not going to work out because they're nervous because they really think it's going to move to Broadway. This is even before the Newman, but they think it's going to move to Broadway. And Jeff's never done a Broadway show, and we can't have, and you've never done a Broadway show. I'd never done one. So they said, we really don't think we should have 2 stage managers who are inexperienced, who haven't been to Broadway. So I was very upset, to say the least. But soon after that, I was offered some show at the theater, what was called the Theater de Lille then, which is now the L'Hotel, to do a new play, and it had some really good people in it. And I thought, okay, this is okay. I'm the head guy here. I would only be an assistant on Chorus Line, I was trying to convince myself that I wasn't upset. Well, I'm not kidding. The day after I signed my contract in that, Jeff called up and he said, you know, the person that they had in mind didn't work out. They didn't want him. So Michael said, you can do it. And I said, I just signed a contract. I know this sounds unbelievable. I said, I just signed a contract. And he goes, well, it has to be like right now. It has to be right. And I was like, well, I can't. I just signed this contract. In fact, I think have we started rehearsal? I can't even remember now. Well, we were just starting rehearsal. Anyway, long story short, I didn't do chorus line at that point. And that summer I went back that it opened on Broadway in July of '75. I was working back at the Delacorte again. And I had a great experience up there, but I would take the bus home. I lived downtown. When the bus would go down Broadway, I couldn't look to the right at 44th Street because that huge marquee was up over the Schubert with a chorus line, which of course was the biggest thing until Hamilton at that point. And I thought I was going to kill myself. But Jeff stuck with me, and of course the show was a huge, huge success. They immediately launched 2 other companies, and Jeff was moved up to supervisor, and he hired me to come into the New York company as an assistant to a guy who they had hired. Well, that guy was soon fired. And it's a long story, and I won't bore you with all the details. But he was, it's just the way these crazy things happen. I think they were actually going to send me out to one of the 2 new tours that were just going out. But this guy got fired on Broadway, who was an old gypsy dancer that was a friend of Michael Bennett's. And anyway, he got fired, and I got the New York job, and I was co-stage managers with a gentleman named Frank Hartenstein. Was another very, very experienced stage manager. He had a lot more experience then than I did. And this is odd to have 2 co-stage managers. And I was told that I would be the one dealing with the actors and the performances, and he would deal with the technical. Well, Frank, and I don't blame him, became very frustrated with this, and he quit. So I became the sole PSM, and I was 27 or something. And I had no experience, no experience on Broadway. And I think a lot of the guys on the tour who were taking out the 2 tours were not happy about it, that this young whippersnapper went in there. Anyway, that's my long way of saying how I got my first big break, and that really was a huge, huge break to be a PSM on Broadway on a huge hit, and that served me well for a long, long time. And I did the show for about 3 years. I did the show for 3 years until the end of '78, and then I decided, should I just drone on and on?
Yeah, I'm very interested in all. You are just continuing with all the questions that I would ask, so please, absolutely.
I can talk forever. Anyway, I stayed with it for about 3 years, and it was hard. It was very, very difficult because this was a difficult group of people. Michael Bennett was brilliant. Probably, and I worked with some really, really, really good directors. As far as musicals go, he was also a very good play director, but I only worked with him in a musical. He was without equal. He was just absolutely incredible, and he did me a great favor because I had come in just after they had been open about 6 months on Broadway, and he did me a huge favor because it was hard for me. I was suddenly dealing with, most of the original cast was still in New York. Some of them had gone out to the LA production. And it was very hard as a young guy who had never done Broadway, dealing with these people who were in this huge hit. And it was just some very difficult situations. Also, I'll be frank, it was the height of drugs being taken. So there was a lot of drug taking in the cast. It was kind of a free-for-all in some ways, because Michael went away for a while because he had been dealing with it for so many years. He didn't pay attention for a while, and then he'd come back and he would be very unhappy, and it was very, very difficult. But it was also great experience. And when they were moving a company to Chicago, the company out in LA had played a year and a half, and they were moving to Chicago, and he got a week's rehearsal before they opened in Chicago, almost like he was doing it all over again, but within a week. And he invited me, he flew me out to Chicago and put me at his side for the entire week. And every single time he would go up to an actor and talk to them. You know, he did a lot of that, walking up to an individual actor and putting his arm around him. He would always include me. And I could hear everything that he was saying to these actors. And that was an enormous favor to me, because the actors then looked at me a little bit differently, you know, because I had been with him during a rehearsal. And it really, it was great. It was a great experience to work with him. Like I said, he was a difficult man, and sometimes there was great substance abuse, and he could be really hard to deal with. But that experience really sort of launched me in the city, in New York theater, in a way that I can't imagine that a lot of the things that follow wouldn't have happened without that. And when I finally did leave, it was for a very good project, and I went back to the public, and I went on an off-Broadway contract because it was Mike Nichols. And it was Mike Nichols directing Christopher Plummer in a play written by Edgar Doctorow, who wrote Ragtime. And they did it at the Newman. And it was not a very good play. It was, but it was fascinating. It was like an intellectual debate. And, but I was like, I don't care if this is, you know, less than half the money I was making. Oh, it was about a third of the money I was making on Broadway. I was so thrilled to be with Mike Nichols, and Tony Walton did the set, and costumes, and Christopher Plummer, and anyway, it didn't last long, but it was a fantastic experience. And it was a dream director. If I just said that Michael Bennett was a brilliant director of musicals, Mike Nichols had a way with actors that I've never seen before or since. And he hardly said anything to them. I've thought about it a lot. I thought about it a lot during the process. And I thought, what exactly is he giving them? And what I realized is he was giving them confidence. And it was particularly evident on a play that wasn't very good. I mean, and they were struggling with it. The actors were struggling with it. But he filled them with such confidence that they did the very best they could, and and they all held together. Nobody got really depressed or discouraged, even though it wasn't going well, you know, and we didn't get very good reviews. But it was a real lesson to me, and I had the good fortune to work with him again later on. And I'm sure Peter Lawrence had 100 stories about Mike. But anyway, after that, I'm going to backtrack one second. During the years laboring in the off-Broadway fields, one of the shows that I worked on was the longest running show in history, The Fantastics, in American history. And it was over at the Sullivan Street, and I got a job on that as the stage manager, and I did that for almost a year. That was amazing experience. And I won't go into detail about it, but it was fun to work on the longest. I was sure I was going to close it. It was in its 13th year when I joined it, and it ran for 40-some years at that one theater.
Jeez.
It was a piano and a bass, and 5, 6 actors, and it was amazing. It was in an old speakeasy there at Sullivan Street. Anyway, see, I told you I could talk forever.
That's perfect.
And the guy who I replaced on that show was a gentleman named Perry Klein. And Perry, we didn't really work together that long because he just taught me the show, that's all. But we're jumping ahead now after Chorus Line, after the doctoral play called Drinks Before Dinner. Perry, meanwhile, was doing very well, and he was working on Broadway doing Bob Fosse's Dancing. And he was leaving the show. And he called me and asked me if I wanted to replace him on it. He was going to recommend me, and I said, absolutely, Bob Fosse. So so I got that job. And I went in on that, and another really, really tough show. The show was so physically demanding on the actors because it was nothing but dance. It really, these performers shouldn't have had to do a show like that 8 times a week. It was just too, it would be like asking an opera singer to sing a full-out opera 8 times a week. Their bodies just couldn't take it. And as a result, there was a lot of unhappiness on that show. And it's too bad because it was really a terrific show. And I think Bob never expected it to run as long as it did. It ran 5 years ultimately. And I think they were hoping to sort of recoup their investment and maybe run a year. So anyhow, that was an extraordinary experience. I would say I did that show for a year and a half, and I would say there were 3 performances where the entire cast was there performing. There were constant injuries, constant injuries. And Gwen Verdon didn't help a lot because she was Bob's sort of unofficial assistant on it. And of course, that was a dream too, that it was Gwen Verdon. But she allowed them to do sometimes partial shows. They would say, the hardest number was the beginning of the 3rd act of Benny Goodman number called Sing, Sing, Sing. And she would allow them to skip that if they were feeling like they couldn't do the whole show. And that was something that I worked on trying to correct. And that was hard because there had been sort of it had been established that that was okay to do that. So I ran into a lot of resistance among the cast on that. But I'll tell you, the times when Bob would come in to rehearse, it was thrilling. It was thrilling to see that. And one time, there was a solo that started one act. Gosh, I can't remember. No, it didn't start it, but it ended Act 1. And it was a male solo, and it was very tricky. And Bob never remembered the steps. So Gwen would always sort of help him remember that. And they were going to sort of rework this dance for this new dancer that had come in. And so Bob and Gwen were there in the rehearsal hall. And this guy was, I don't know, he was held up, delayed. He somehow found out he was going to be about half hour late. So Bob asked Gwen, he said, let's try to figure out what we're going to do here, what we're going to give him. So then Bob and Gwen sort of staged this whole number on Gwen. And it was, I was hoping this dancer would never arrive because it was so great watching them create a dance, you know. It was great. And so moments like that really made that all worthwhile. Let's see, after that, Is this sort of a chronological thing going on? Oh, I have a good Joe Papp story.
Ooh, all right.
I have a good. I mean, it's kind of amusing, because I was thinking back to Chorus Line just for a second. He, Joe Papp, he had never done musicals. It was always the Shakespeare and the David Raid plays and the really gutsy stuff. And if it was a musical, it was Hair. And so Chorus Line was like an alien planet to Joe. He was fascinated by it though, and he would watch rehearsals, and he said, I remember he said one time, he goes, dancers are amazing. He goes, they do what you tell them to do. he couldn't believe it. He said, I've never seen them. They're so obedient. I've never seen anything like it. He goes, you can't do that to actors.
Oh my God.
You can't tell them to go over there and do that. So that was kind of funny. But of course, that show supported that theater for many years to come. So, all right, should we continue chronologically?
Yeah, let's go after Bob Fosse.
I'm like, okay. Also difficult for me, it was a personal time during Bob Fosse because my mother was very, very ill and in fact dying. During the entire time I was on Dancing, it was really, really a coincidence. Right after I started on that, literally a week later, she was diagnosed with cancer, and she died almost a year to the day after that, and then my father died 5 months after that of a separate illness altogether. So that's the year and a half on Dancing, and right after my father died, it had been a really rough time. So I quit Dancing, and I took the summer off. I had been working constantly, and I took the summer off and traveled and tried to sort of pull myself together again. And right after that, I came back, and I got a call the day I came back. I was in Greece, actually, for about a month, and I got a call to do Children of a Lesser God on Broadway, which had been running for a little while at that point, about a year, I think. And Frank Marina was the PSM leaving, and I loved it because I wanted to work on a play again, and I really loved that play. And I think it's going to be revived soon, actually.
I think it is.
Yeah. And it was quite an experience working with deaf actors. Sort of 2/3 of them were deaf. And so that required a whole different thing. And I learned a little ASL, a little American Sign Language, which I've forgotten. But we had translators who were on staff so that we could, for rehearsals and stuff. But we didn't have them at night, at every performance. So it was quite something. And I tried to keep up as much as I could with the sign language, but some of them were rather militant, and I don't blame them. Even though they could lip read, they would sometimes act as if they couldn't lip read. So you would have to struggle with the sign language, or you could write it out, which very often I did too. I would write out notes because I was concerned about my ability to convey nuance with my sign language. But it was a woman, an extraordinary woman who has since died, who won the Tony Award that year, Phyllis Fralick, who played the lead, and it was terrific trying to deal with that whole other world. World. And there were also things like when we would call people, we'd have to use the TTY, when we were calling them for rehearsal or whatever reason. We had to have cue lights for all the entrances. It was the quietest backstage I've ever been on in my entire life. You sometimes during the show you would think the theater was dark and empty because there was just very, very little talking. But a great experience. And gosh, that's only bringing us up to the mid-'80s. Or or early 80s. After that, I went to see Joe Papp. He had a brief nightclub career, if you can believe it. He had this thing about being a performer. Sort of Borscht Belty, Yiddish theater kind of thing, you know. Anyway, he performed, gosh, I forget what the name of it is. It used to be over on West Broadway, very near here. And it was a club. And he did a whole act in a tie and tails, white tie and tails, and a cane. And he sang songs and told stories. Anyway, when I was going in there, Richard Kornberg had been the assistant press agent on Chorus Line to a guy named Bob Ullman at the Public, on Broadway. I ran into Richard there, and he was talking to a friend of his named Bernie Carraher, and I think it's just kind of a joke, Richard said to Bernie, he said, because this is Peter von Mayrhauser, he's the best stage manager on Broadway. He's like, okay. So we went in and watched the show and all that stuff. Well, I don't know how many months later, I got a call from Bernie Carraher, and he said he was doing a new musical with Tommy Tune, and he wanted me to be the PSM on this. So I was like, oh, interesting. And that was just based on that. That was another one of those little fluky things. I didn't know this guy from Adam. No idea who he was. And so anyway, I was set up for a meeting with Tommy, to meet Tommy, and he was rehearsing the musical Nine at the top of the New Amsterdam, pre-Disney. And at that point, the whole building was just a shambles. I mean, it was literally falling apart. But the top, which was the old New Amsterdam roof, which was the very glamorous night spot for 100 years ago, there was literally rubble around. It looked like the set for Follies. It was like amazing, but there was still a stage there. And Tommy always rehearses on a stage, and he was rehearsing Nine on the stage of the New Amsterdam roof, and that's where I met him. And of course, I was just, first of all, I also was a fan of Tommy Tunes, because I knew him as a performer and a director of Top Girls, the Carol Churchill play, and is that the name of it, Top Girls?
Yes.
Yeah. Suddenly was thinking of Lena Dunham. Anyway, I was, so the setting was amazing, and Tommy was there smelling a flower, as he usually is when he's watching rehearsal. He holds a flower up to his nose. And we talked for a little while during a break, and then he said, come with me. This is a magical place. So he took me to, I don't know whether it was the ladies' room or the men's room. It was kind of falling down. I'm wondering what's going on here. And there was a little window that he opened up, and he pushed out, and he said, look down there. So I leaned out the window, and it was the Nederlander Theater, which was called something else then, I think. And he said, that's where Lena is. It's where Lena Horne was doing Lady and Her Music, which actually I'd seen, which was amazing. Ran a year there. And he said, that's what's inspiring me. I feel Lena every single day coming up during rehearsal. This is how Tommy is. He's fantastic. He's just fantastic. So, at that point, anyhow, the show was called My One and Only. And, but Tommy was involved with Nine at that point, and my One and Only was scheduled for the following year. And there followed then, because these were new producers, Bernie Carraher and he had two partners, they took a year to try to raise financing for this Gershwin show. And it was a hard sell because the director was the 24-year-old wunderkind, Peter Sellers, who was from the opera world, totally, and a very unusual character, who I met and instantly liked, actually. And Tommy said to me, he's a little strange, but we want a different approach to this show. So Peter Sellers was the director. And he had a designer named Craig Smith, named Adrian LaBelle, and Craig Smith was the musical director. And Adrian LaBelle had designed a little set that she had conceived for this production of My One and Only. And I went on a dog and pony show with them for months, where we would take this set around, the set model, and Peter Sellers would pitch this show to various producers and investors and stuff. And he would go on and on and on. I mean, it was an amazing show that he did for this. Well, they finally got Paramount Pictures interested in this show, and it went into rehearsal, and disaster. It was a complete disaster, because Peter Sellers, as brilliant as he is, really had no concept of how to put together a Broadway show. And we were trying out in Boston, and he never did between the scenes. We would always rehearse a scene, and then we would rehearse another scene, and then we would rehearse another scene. Tommy, meanwhile, was choreographing it, and he was off figuring out his choreography. But Peter would just rehearse scenes. There were no transitions. There was no incidental music. There was no, and we had this great Gershwin music, and we had access to their trunk of songs, but it was really, really bad. Long story, a little bit shorter. We went to Boston. The show was a flop. Kevin Kelly, who was then writing for New York Magazine, but was a Boston critic, but writing for New York Magazine, he wrote an article about us in New York Magazine when we were still in Boston, and said falling flat on its funny face, because it was loosely based on Funny Face. Falling flat, and the show was horrible. But what happened was Peter Sellers was fired very, very quickly up in Boston. He was out, and Mike Nichols arrived. Tommy had done a show with him at Long Wharf, 2 years before, something that never came into New York. Had a good relationship with Mike. Mike happened to be in between projects. Mike came in, Peter Stone came in to rewrite the book. Adrian LaBelle's concept was kept, but Tony Walton came in. Tony Walton was handled the impossible task of redesigning the show with the same scenery, because there was no more money. We soon realized that we would not be able to change the show in Boston, so we just sort of gave up on, they gave up on that. But everybody was encouraged by the fact that Mike was there, because he was Mike Nichols, and we were going to be saved. And he went slowly about the work of rewriting the book with Peter Stone, even though Mike never got billing for it. He was paid, but he didn't get billing. And we slowly made improvements. And when that Kevin Kelly article came out in New York Magazine, Mike Nichols held up that magazine. We were all just down in the dumps. And he goes, "This is the best thing that could have happened to us." And everybody's like, "What? How could that possibly be a positive thing?" And he said, "Because there's nowhere to go but up." He goes, "The expectations for this show are so low right now in New York. It was like a laughing stock. He said, "This is to our advantage." And we came back to New York. He persuaded Paramount Pictures to put $1 million more into it. We went back into rehearsal totally, delayed previews, and they turned it around, and it became a modest hit. It ran for 2 years. It recouped its investment. We won 3 Tony Awards. We took the show to Japan with Tommy, and it was another just incredible experience. Incredible to work with Mike Nichols during all that. So many wonderful stories about him, and Tommy Tune was amazing. And speaking of directors, what Tommy was able to do was move people in space. He's such a visual artist, and he was able to conceive. We had panels that came up from the basement, and obviously flew them in too, and they came in sideways, so we did a lot of up and down and side to side. And Tony just repainted them in very vivid colors. They had been sort of brown and black. And just working with Tommy on that, I understood as a stage manager exactly what he wanted, because he was able to explain that to me in terms that really made sense. You know, as this moves in, I want this, and as this and this, and he would do lots of gesturing that made it very clear to me, and it was a joy to be on that show. Okay, I have to laugh because I just asked Rachel to pause it for a second because I felt I was rambling on too much. I just get going on a lot of this stuff because it's bringing back a lot of memories, and it's a life that I had that for so many years that was so important to me, and just talking about it, it's bringing back these incredible memories. Anyway, I've been very, very lucky. So we're at my one and only. Yeah, we took it to Japan. It was very, very satisfying. At this point in my life, I was having a little trouble with being at a theater for 6 days a week. I was, and I'd had some long-run shows. In fact, most of the shows I named ran a long time, and I was getting impatient with that. Always 8 shows a week, 6 days a week, and I was thinking about producing and about going into that. Well, how do you do that? That's very tricky. But a friend of mine was a manager, company manager, and then an associate general manager, and she and I were talking about starting an office together where we would general manage and hopefully produce. General manage to sort of support ourselves and then produce. And her name is Barbara Darwall, and she and I opened the tour of my one and only. We took it to Japan. I did it for a few more months, and then I left to start this office in New York with Barbara Darwall von Mayrhauser, and we had an office from 85 to 90, and that was another amazing experience. Very, very different, obviously, than stage management, but it was an area. I told you that or maybe I didn't say it on this recording, that I subscribed to Variety at a very early age. Yes, I did.
You did.
I had always been interested in the business side of it as well. In fact, that was one of the things that I felt served me as a stage manager, because I was very, very conscious of budgets, and I was very conscious when the company manager or general managers would say to me, we got to be careful about this, we got to be careful about that. It all made sense to me, and I understood how important it was. So I had a little background in that, and I mean a feeling about that, for that. So anyway, we did this office, and we ended up doing a lot of budgets for a lot of shows. And we managed a few shows, and we produced a few shows. We produced off-Broadway shows here at the West Side Arts and at the old Circle on the Square downtown on Bleecker. And we produced a show out in LA, in a 99-seat house, one of those waiver houses out in LA. A play with Marissa Tomei, and we did some really good stuff. But we never got the big commercial things. What sort of did us in, we were the general managers on an ill-fated show, a Broadway musical called Nick and Nora, directed by Arthur Lawrence and book by Arthur Lawrence. And anyway, we became involved in that as general managers, and we worked on that for 2.5 years, which is not unusual for a new musical, for people at that point to get on very early on board, like managers. And long story short, the producers that had hired us, a really great team named James Pentecost and Charlie Sussman, they were shoved aside when the show was having problems, in development problems. We did a workshop that didn't go well. They were shoved aside and we were fired. So we had really staked a lot on that show, and we had done other things too, but when that went away, this was 1990, we made a decision then to close down the office. But I don't mean to give short shrift to those years. They were very, very important to me and really contributed a lot to my knowledge of theater and to my experience. And it's another reason why theater can be so wonderful. There's many parts of it, and that was a very intriguing part. But I really missed getting a paycheck, particularly that equity paycheck.
Correct.
And once again, I really lucked out, because Tommy Tune had gone on to do other things, and he had not been happy, by the way, that I had left the My One and Only tour, because he was on it, and he was not pleased about it, and didn't speak to me for about 2 years. Yeah, he was pissed off. They don't like it when you leave. They never do. But you have to get through it. And I did. And when we closed down the office, Barbara and I, literally within 2 weeks, I got a call, and Tommy was doing a workshop of the Will Rogers Follies. And he wanted me to do it. I guess he was speaking to me again then. He didn't call me directly, but he asked, he heard that I was available again. And it was not only a workshop, we were rehearsing in the Nederlander, but it already was going to be moving to Broadway. That was the whole plan. He just needed a developmental process first. And that began absolutely wonderful experience. I have to say, for the record, the Will Rogers Follies is not the best show that has ever come along. However, I would say it was the show that I had the most fun, pure fun in my entire career. That was really delightful. And one of the reasons was Michael Bizzarro. I don't know if you remember the name Perry Klein, but I had I had taken over the Fantastics from Perry Klein. I had taken over Dancin' from Perry Klein, and I was looking for some new people. And I called Perry Klein, and he said, "You have to use Michael Bizzarro." And I had interviewed a few people, and this was it was during the workshop. It was during the workshop because I had to hire somebody for Broadway. And I had torn a calf muscle. And I was on crutches. It was terrible. I had to do a whole workshop on crutches.
Oh, no.
It was terrible, but I was terrified about losing the job, so I just did it. Anyhow, I met Michael over at the Nederlander, and I knew instantly that this was going to be a good match. And it was. I'm not going to go on and on about Michael, but he was just fantastic. He was the second assistant on that. There was a first assistant named Patrick Ballard, who I'd worked with on Dancing prior. Anyway, we moved right into the Broadway after we did the workshop, which went very well. We moved right into the Broadway rehearsal period, and we were booked into the Palace. And it was the reopening of the Palace, actually. It had been redone. And, it was just an amazing experience to work on this show. We had there were 16 Ziegfeld girls in it, and 3 swings, I think 3 female swings. So there were 19 girls in it, and everybody said, oh, it's going to be a terrible situation, it's going to be cat fights all the time. Well, it wasn't at all. It was just great. And it was just a lot of fun to be around all these lovely girls, and and Tommy treated them really, really well. And we had a fantastic leading man, Keith Carradine, who's like the nicest person that ever lived on the planet Earth. He's just wonderful. And the star sets the tone, and he set a wonderful tone in that show. He's just a magnificent person. So that was a terrific experience. That for some reason, it still bewilders me. We won the Tony Award for Best Musical over Miss Saigon. I think that was more to do with an anti-Cameron McIntosh thing at that point than it was pro-Will Rogers. But I have to tell one story about Will Rogers, though, that was very disturbing, and it involves Actors' Equity. There was a lot of fuss raised by the fact that none of the women in the original group were black. And Tommy had not wanted that. He had wanted to have, in fact, he wanted to have at least half black. And during the audition period, I was there at all the auditions. He just couldn't find the people he wanted. And Equity gave us a lot of grief about this. And I was really, really upset by this, because there were a lot of accusations made, and not nice things being said. And it really bothered me, because I didn't feel that was a true indication of the atmosphere over there at all. And we had to go over to Equity and defend ourselves, and it was particularly upsetting. At one point, I came into an audition we were having. This was actually after we opened, and we were doing a call, and I walked in to find a representative from Equity sitting at the back of the theater in the Palace, and I didn't know that was going to be the case. And I said, "What's going on here?" I won't say his name, but he was in charge of non-traditional casting at Equity at the time. And rather nastily, he said, "We're just checking up to see what goes on at your auditions." And I found that really unnecessary and mean and unwarranted. And anyway, we got through that, and eventually, actually, there were a number of black women that were in it. But that was a difficult thing. But I have to say this about Equity, and I've had my run-ins with them. On Dancing, I was involved in the first Just Cause case, where Bob Fosse I had to go in with Jules Fisher, who was the producer and lighting designer, and Bob Fosse, and the girl that Bob wanted to fire, which up to that point had been, as long as you gave him a couple weeks salary, you could fire people. And Bob was forced to tell this girl in front, right in front of everybody, why she was being fired. And he hated doing it, and it was embarrassing for her. And I felt it was a situation where Equity had really embarrassed one of their members, and unnecessarily so. Now there is a just cause buyout clause, and even though Equity doesn't look favorably upon it, it is, it's a necessity with these long-run shows.
Of course.
I'm going to say one more thing about Equity. I think you're going to want to shut me up soon.
Never.
I am so happy that stage managers are in Equity, Actors Equity Association. If we actors and stage managers didn't have a union like that, it would be terrible. It would be terrible. The union really does protect us, and even though I think they've gone into areas maybe where they shouldn't, where they are most important and they're essential is in the benefits that they provide their members. And particularly in today's climate, these benefits are terrific. They're really terrific. The health care benefits, the pension benefits, they're very unusual in today's world, and members should really, really appreciate that. I'm right now on an equity pension, and it's just wonderful. Anyway, I'm going to sort of wrap this up now, because what happened after this, in as far as my career goes, I have one more just fabulous experience. I was another wonderful person in my life, in my career. I remember meeting him outside Lincoln Center, going in to see a show. A friend introduced us. His name is Fred Hansen, and he was at that time the PSM on Miss Saigon. I guess I was doing Will Rogers, and he called me up sometime later and said that the Carousel production that I'd heard about, the National Theatre of Great Britain, was going to be coming to New York, to Lincoln Center, actually. And I said, yeah, I've read about it. It's supposed to be amazing. And he said, well, how would you like to be the PSM on it? And I said, same director as Miss Saigon, Nick Heitner. I said, but you're his PSM. And he said, well, I'm going to be like associate director on it. And so the position is open. How would you like to do it? Now, Fred Hansen did not know me, and I still, to this day, it's just amazing to me that he recommended me. So I met Nick Heitner, I got the job, Carousel. If Will Rogers was the most fun I had, I would say the Carousel production was the best thing I ever worked on, the best production of a great show and a great production. Nick Heitner was amazing. It was thrilling to work on that production. I every day it was a pleasure to work on that. So I did that at Lincoln Center, and then that unfortunately only ran a year, or a little longer. No, only a year, and it should have run longer. But Fred came to me and he said, no one knows this yet, but the production supervisor on Phantom of the Opera is going to be leaving soon. Of course, that was the chorus line in Hamilton, sort of its day. And I was like, you're kidding. Now, Phantom at that point had been running almost 7 years. But he said, the supervisor is leaving. How would you like to do that? And I was like, wow. Because once again, I was thinking about the 6 day a week, 8 performances a week. So I said, sure, I'd love to do that. So Fred got me, I didn't know Hal Prince or Cameron McIntosh or Andrew Lloyd Webber. And he got me introduced to everybody, and I got the job. I think one of the reasons I got the job is that I hadn't worked with any of them. So I wasn't in anybody's camp. I was completely separate. And I think for Cameron and for Hal, the fact that I worked with Nick Heidner on this really legendary production of Carousel really carried some weight. So then I became, for longer than you can ever imagine, the production supervisor of Phantom, all the American companies, and I supervised. At that point, when I joined, we had the Broadway company and 3 companies in the U.S. I just did the American companies. I didn't do any international. And I did that job for over 17 years. About 5 years in, 2 of those other companies closed. But for those first few years, it was quite something dealing with 4 companies and casting and being a liaison with Hal and Cameron and Andrew's office and all that. It was really, I had my hands full. And I just have to say another word about a great director. For stage managers, directors are everything. Directors are everything. Doesn't matter about the material, it's the director and the producer, but the director is everything. And Hal Prince, once again, here I was coming in, 7 years in, poor guy, he had been dealing with the show. He had launched all these other companies overseas by this point, and these 4 American companies, and he went with me and visited every single, we had 2 tours and a sit down in California. And he visited all of those companies with me, watched the performances with me. I got to sit with him while he's giving notes to everybody in this cast, which immediately, once again, put me in a position with the casts that they saw that I was that I was with Hal and that I was on the same wavelength and that I knew what Hal said. They couldn't say to me, which they often say in a long run when you come in, no, the director told me that, So that was an enormous favor that Hal did for me. He's a great man of the theater. What can you say about Hal Prince? He's just amazing. This is the man who has the overall concept of the show. He's not a stager per se. He sees the huge picture, and he knows how to pick people to work together, and he is without equal as well. So that was how I spent up until retirement, actually, was on the Phantom. But during that, actually about 5 years in, as I said, 2 of those touring companies did close. So I only had 1 touring company and Broadway. And I did have some more time then, so I would take on other shows, sometimes usually through the Wasser office, who were the general managers. Like I did Cameron's flop show, putting it together with Carol Burnett. I did that just till it opened. And I did Chitty Chitty Bang Bang with Michael Pizarro again. Michael really, really ran that show. I was more like a supervisor. That was really Michael's show. And then I didn't even stay with it after opening. I just sort of hovered around every once in a while. So I did other things while I was doing Phantom, but Phantom really dominated the rest of my career. Do you have anything else that possibly could interest you?
What made you decide that retirement was now? What
Well,
made you-
I think because, well, first of all, I've been working 42 years in New York at that point. And really almost without break. I mean, seriously, I've been very lucky, but it was something. In fact, I knew I had carousel back in '93, and it didn't start till '94, so I took a few months off, and that's the last time I had a break. Was in 1994. I mean, really, seriously. So it was really, which was great, but I guess I just had enough. A number of my friends have asked me since I retired, they say, well, don't you miss it? And I have to say, no, I don't. What I miss is what it was for me for all those years, because it was everything. It was so wonderful and difficult and crazy. Oh my God, I didn't even mention Sweet Smell of Success, which I did with Michael Pizzaro during Phantom also, which was also with Nick Heitner. It was a flop on Broadway. It was underrated. Anybody in that cast will tell you, and who worked on it, it was undeserving of its fate. It was an amazing show. Anyway, to go back to retirement, I just said that's enough. It didn't mean to me what it had meant, and I guess I was a little wiped out. What I've been able to do since then, I write reviews occasionally for a small paper on the East Side. I go to lots of theater. I'm a subscriber at all sorts of nonprofits here in the city. New York Theater Workshop, Playwrights Horizon, Second Stage, Public, all these places. I go to a lot of shows. Can't afford Broadway. But
Same.
whatever happened to invited dress rehearsals? So it was great, but it was enough.
With the not having a break since 1994, how did you sustain your work-life balance through your 42 years in your career?
Interesting, work-life balance. Well, I think my relationship, I'm married. Well, I've been with this, who is now my husband, I've been with him for 35 years. We met during my one and only. I was the PSM, he was in it.
I'm sorry, you met during my one and only. That's a story.
We met during my one and only. What can I say? When I was struggling out of town, as I told you, it was a flop, and I never had a break. Every single meal break, I was rewriting my book and trying to figure out what was going to happen after lunch and all that. And David, his name is David Jackson, he would come, and all of a sudden he'd be at my elbow with like a grilled cheese sandwich and a milkshake, saying, here, I noticed that you haven't taken a break in 3 days or something, And, so anyhow, very fortunate. I think in my case, sometimes when both people are in showbiz, that can be a problem. But in this case, it worked very well because we understood what the other's life was. Also, our schedules were pretty much the same. We did that show together, but never anything again together. But he was in shows, when I was stage managing shows. So the schedules weren't that different. And he's an amazing guy, and so it's worked out very, very well. And he's retired now, too, because he just couldn't do jump splits anymore. But but it's a great life, theater, and I feel like I played hooky all my adult life. It's a great place, and you're very lucky if you can make a living in it.
What would your advice be to younger stage managers who are just starting?
I bet you've asked that to everybody, and I bet most of them have said something along these lines. Keep yourself open to any experience. Go out, be out there. especially at the beginning, just do it. Find work. There's so much work for no money, but do those things. Do those things. Hopefully, you do them with good people. But just be available and work hard, and it'll happen. I don't know what to say beyond that. I don't think you need to go to school for it. Sorry, Michael. But but I think it's great to go to school for it. I went to Northwestern for it, but I'm not so sure that really prepared me, other than meeting some really terrific people. But that's all. I think it's just being willing to work hard. And it's hard at the beginning because you feel like there's a lot of competition, first of all. There's a huge amount of competition. But on the other hand, there's a lot going on now. There's a lot going on. Much more than when I came to the city. I came in the early 70s, and it was pretty grim. It was pretty grim. Manny Eisenberg, who was a producer at that time, I guess he's still around. I had an interview with him because I was interviewing everybody. He was a general manager and producer, and he said to me, "Get out of it. Don't even, if you can, don't do this. This business is failing. You should have been here. It all died a few years ago. There's nothing happening. It's going to the dogs. Theaters are dark. It's true. Half the Broadway theaters were dark." He said, it's not healthy. He said, if you can do something else, do it. This is a dying business, But I remembered something my 7th grade teacher said to me. I remember this so well. He said, all your life, people are going to be telling you it was better before. They always do. They always say, oh, you should have been here last year. Because it's not true. So people always think that what happened, especially when they were younger, was better. It's not true. This is an exciting time. This is an exciting time. There's a lot of activity in theater. There's a lot of great talent out there. So go for it.
Speaking of it was always better before, where do you think the future of stage management is going, and how do you think it's changed since now that you're on the other side, you can kind of look back?
Well, I think it's changed a lot. I think it's, you have to be a lot more technically savvy now. There's a lot more demands in that area as far as that, keeping up with the latest technology in a lot of ways. There's a lot more regulations now. That equity rule book is thicker and thicker. When I first started equity, it was about 16 pages. It was a little pamphlet. No. There's just more. There's more. It's not paperwork now because everything is digital, but there's more of that kind of work. There's more reports you have to do. There's more layers of management. There used to be on most shows, sort of, there was a company manager, a general manager, and a producer, and now there's all sorts of levels of middle management and stuff that a stage manager has to report to or be accountable to, and there's a lot more people with input. That's hard. It's much easier when there's sort of one. That's why Cameron McIntosh, it was great on that because he was the producer. Beginning and the end of the story. I mean, Andrew is a co-producer, but Andrew really didn't get involved with that end of it very much. And when Hal Prince was a producer, he was the producer, and that's hard for stage managers. Now, I think it's hard. I think it's something that's changed, and it's something that stage managers in the future just have to deal with, But on the other hand, it's exciting, too, because there are all sorts of new things happening. There's all sorts of people writing for the theater now that weren't writing. Good writers who have been in, getting the sort of plum jobs in television and cable and all that, are writing for theater. A lot of them are either coming back to theater or coming to theater for the first time because they're interested. So, and Broadway theaters are packed. Nonprofits in this city are doing very well, extremely well. There's a lot of theater regionally now. There always was, but it's much higher quality now. So, if it's not for Broadway, everybody knows there's a huge theater scene in Chicago. Not much in LA. There never will be, but. It's funny because of all that talent out there, but it doesn't seem to happen out there. But there's a lot going on, and so I would think it would be very exciting, also along with these new challenges. Have you observed that?
Yeah, I will. I mean, something that I've been thinking about is that you were talking about Children of a Lesser God. And I was thinking, in my mind nowadays, because I worked on Tribes at Studio in DC.
Oh, yeah.
And, we were able to email daily calls. And I was thinking, back before email, how would you how would you contact your deaf actors? So it is making me think about where we were and how far we've come and what is going to continue.
Right, exactly. That's interesting? Yeah, that's interesting. Oh, you worked on Tribes.
Yeah.
I loved that show.
It's a beautiful show.
Yeah, it was just lovely. Yeah, that's a very good example of how something has changed, And because there's greater communication now, it's so easy. I mean, bang, bang, texts and emails and blah, blah, blah. But that much more is required of you then. It wasn't required. I mean, I would take a report of the public. I would type up a report. I would stick it under Bertie Gersten's door. And that was it. I typed up, I think I kept a copy for myself, on Mimeo paper or whatever you call it, carbon paper. But that's it. I would just stick that's nowadays, oh my God, it's huge. What's required, so good luck to all.
Well, Peter, is there anything else you want to say about your life, your career, stage management, the world?
No. You've caught me at a very up moment. I'm feeling very positive about things going forward, so it's great.
Well, thank you so much, Peter. This has been a pleasure.
Yeah, pleasure for me as well.